Hello and welcome back. This is the week 14 lecture. So today I would like to finish Blake. This will be the second lecture that I give on the novel, but as we know, last week I was mostly just introducing the book, talking a little bit about Martin Delaney, the author, and providing a little bit of historical context and background that I thought would be helpful as you guys got started. Hopefully by now you're moving into part two. But even if you're not, we still have a lot of time. I am devoting 2 weeks to this book just because it is rather difficult to get through, both because of subject matter and style. But I do think it's rewarding if we're able to adjust to its peculiar rhythms and, work our way through it. So we do have until the end of this week to finish the book. And then we have our final reading assignment next week. It will be very light, just a single short story from the collection, The Amber Gods. So I would love to do that entire collection, and hopefully some of you will get interested in Spofford and you'll want to read more. But for our purposes, we're just going to read one short story from that collection next week, and that will be our final required text. So we are getting close to the end of the semester. So at the end of this lecture, if you guys can make it, your reward will be to hear a little bit more about our final assignments, the final exam and the final paper. I'll also talk a little bit about the proposal and critical summary that's due at the end of this week. I don't want you guys, it's due in the middle of next week. So it's kind of weird. Unlike most of our deadlines, it's not going to be the end of a week. It's not going to be Sunday night. I actually made the deadline Wednesday of week 15. But you guys are welcome to get those in earlier if possible, because I would like to look at those as soon as possible. I'll be looking at them as soon as they come in so I can give you a little bit of instant feedback on your idea for the final paper. That's really just, that's the goal, is, just a way for us to get started. We need to start thinking about the paper, start doing a little bit of research, and I'm happy to meet with any of you if you have questions or concerns about that final paper. We can do a video conference, we can exchange emails, phone call, whatever works for you. Just get in touch and we can work something out. Okay, so like I said, last week was mostly an introduction to the book, so this week let's really tackle some of the content. We will not be able to be comprehensive, but we can work through some stuff in part one and then progress into part two. But if you haven't already, I would encourage you guys to read the introduction to the edition that I ordered, and I hope we have this edition, the contemporary Harvard University edition. And if you have it, read the introduction by Jerome McGann. I mentioned him sort of briefly last week, but he's a really good scholar, a really good American Lit scholar, and he also happens to be sort of the foremost scholar, our leading scholar on this book and Martin Delaney. So he's probably done more with this particular novel and Delaney's career than any other scholar I'm aware of. So he really is an authority. He's also responsible for putting together this very modern, very definitive edition from Harvard that I want to use with a lot of other books, with a lot of other authors. It doesn't always matter that much if we're all using the same edition. It's always convenient because the pagination will be the same. So then we can literally be on the same page. But with stuff like Melville and Hawthorne and Poe, there's been so many editions of their work. They've been published for so long and studied for so long that there's really a lot of good options. I mean, you'll be able to find some good edition that you can use, even if it's not the exact same as mine. That's usually okay. But with Blake, we really need this edition because prior to it, there really wasn't a great scholarly, accurate edition of the novel, and we've already discovered some of the reasons why. I mentioned last week that Delaney published this book serially. So it's a rather long novel, and it was published in installments over, I believe, like a 3-year period from 1859 into like 1861 or even 62. So he published it in a couple of African American newspapers of the time period, but because it was published serially, the novel never really existed all in one place. And also, as we know, Delaney did not finish the novel, so that adds another wrinkle. But McGann's done a lot of excellent scholarship to assemble what we have here, and he also wrote a really good introduction. And I covered some of the stuff that he talks about already. I was kind of using him to guide my own lecture last week, but you should really go straight to the source. McGann is even more helpful than I can be. Probably when it comes to this novel. He's just an excellent scholar. He's done excellent work, and he's going to give you guys what you need to be able to sort of contextualize the book and understand it better. Okay, so I want to just draw your attention today to a few scenes, a few moments in part 1 and in part 2 that I just think are interesting. You guys might not agree. I just wanted to talk about a few features, a few tropes, a few interesting things that we could dig into a little bit more if we wanted to study the novel more, if anybody's thinking about potentially writing about it for our seminar paper. So, like I said, I can't be comprehensive. A lot happens. There's a lot of plot mechanics to keep straight. Hopefully you guys are succeeding with that. I don't really want to do a lot of plot summary right now. I just want to draw your attention to a few things that might illustrate some larger sort of threads or features in this book that we could definitely do a lot more with. So I'll just remind you quickly, one thing I was talking about last week was the distinction between what we might call the rhetorical function of this novel versus the mimetic function. So I talked about mimesis as just kind of what a lot of novels are trying to do. We might just think of it as realism in a really basic way, but mimesis is that quality of that certain books have of sort of echoing or mirroring real life. And like I was saying last week, we often expect a pretty high degree of mimesis, even if we're reading like sci-fi or fantasy, right? Maybe we don't expect the plots to be super realistic in a conventional manner, but we still want our characters to kind of seem like regular people or real people. We want them to sort of talk like people really talk, behave like people really behave. So this is kind of a standard expectation for a lot of readers. Although it varies depending on what genre we're looking at, what text we're looking at, but it's a pretty standard thing. And I was mentioning that sometimes we kind of maybe overlook the mimetic qualities of Blake because it's clearly making an argument. It's clearly fulfilling this rhetorical function, and that's what a lot of people have talked about in the past, right? And I mentioned that last week. Clearly, Delaney is making an argument here about African American liberation, about insurrection sort of as a physical event, and also, like we were saying, as a conceptual category, as an idea. Something that African Americans have to sort of wrap their minds around before they can fully become free, right? Independence is a process because it's largely a mental process. And it's not just Delaney who talks about this. Like I mentioned last week, other African American intellectuals of the time were sort of talking about similar things. Frederick Douglass talks about some similar things. Like you have to arrive at a consciousness that you are free, that you should be free, that you were born free and a great injustice has been done to you, which has rendered you no longer free. And Douglas and Delaney and others, they say that doesn't really happen like instantaneously. Like that's a process, and it's obviously aided by education, by literacy, which was of course slaves were barred from obtaining literacy. But Douglas talks about how once he could read, he became much more aware of his situation. So it's similar. That's kind of similar to what we're talking about here in Blake. It's a mental process. You have to come to a realization that you are free. You deserve certain things. You have to kind of learn about the larger sort of tradition of slavery, the history of slavery, what other people are saying about slavery, in order to fully grasp your own situation. So part of that process is this sort of idea of rebellion. Rebelling against the dominant society, what they tell you, the role that they've defined for you. And yes, ultimately that rebellion might manifest in physical, like literal ways. And we talked about how Delaney supported, in some cases, armed rebellion, though he never really took part in any of those himself. But he sort of acknowledged that armed rebellion might be necessary in certain instances. But he also had a plan for African Americans to go back to Africa. That was another thing that he thought might be a solution to the race problems of the U.S. That didn't quite pan out for him. But, he was an organizer. He was a sort of a political leader, a community leader. So he had a lot of ideas and plans for the betterment of his people, of his community. So the novel kind of falls under that category too. He's making an argument. He's sort of appealing to his largely African American audience and sort of showing them or illustrating for them sort of how an insurrection could be planned, how it could be perhaps assembled, but also just the kind of frame of mind, the sort of thinking that would be necessary for liberation, for true independent or sort of individual freedom. So we talked about all that. So yeah, there's a lot of rhetorical stuff going on, and sometimes people describe the book as didactic, very much focused on instruction, teaching, and some people think that maybe the rhetorical function overwhelms the aesthetic function or the mimetic function that we often look for in novels. And that's an argument that you could certainly make. Others have made it. It's not totally wrong all the time, but one thing I wanted to do today was just point out a couple of scenes where there is a high level of realism, and there's a certain kind of realism that we're not necessarily going to find in a lot of other works of fiction from this time period. So very quickly, let's just go back to that comparison I was making last week with Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a very well-known sentimental novel. Perhaps you guys took a look at it back in week 10 when we were talking about popular fiction. We know it was very popular, and we know that Stowe was using emotions to provide a lesson, moral instruction about the evils of slavery. And we know it was very effective. People read it, people were moved by it, and a lot of readers who might have already been sort of against slavery, but just sort of on the fence or maybe somewhat indifferent, not fully aware of the evils and the horrors of it, many of them were convinced. So the novel had a real sort of tangible social impact. So we know all that. But we also know, I think I mentioned this last week, Stowe is from New England. She may have traveled a little bit through the South or other slaveholding states, but we don't think she had a whole lot of direct experience or knowledge of slaveholding culture. And this is kind of a weird thing for us because, we have to kind of immerse ourselves in that culture in this novel, and it's often very uncomfortable. It's often very brutal, makes us perhaps feel uncomfortable. But again, we're getting a high level of sort of granular detail here from Delaney. He's taking us up close to certain customs, certain conventions, certain aspects of the culture of these places that a lot of American readers would not have been familiar with then or now. And we don't necessarily get that in a work like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Not to disparage Stowe. I mean, she did a great job, obviously, and the book's very effective. And I'm not even saying that the book is full of inaccuracies. But as we discussed last week, Stowe just isn't able to get quite as close. She doesn't have firsthand knowledge. She's largely relying on things that she's read, things that she's heard, things that are, second or third hand accounts. And though she's a very skilled sentimental writer, there might be a little bit of a lack of authenticity at times, at least when we compare it to Blake. Because Delaney does get us much closer. And I just wanted to kind of show you guys some examples of what I mean. A couple of scenes, particularly this first one that we're going to look at, very brief. It's a brief scene. And it might seem rather odd, kind of puzzling in some ways. I think it can be easy to overlook if you're not specifically paying attention for some of the stuff that I'm going to point out. But these are moments where Delaney delivers a level of accuracy about slave culture and sort of the larger slave holding culture that dominated the South and, border states like Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, where slavery was also still in existence during this time. He's getting us a level of sort of cultural detail that we're just not going to find in many other places. And of course, he's capturing the African American experience in a way that white authors simply could not. So we talked about Melville in that regard as well. For Melville and for Stowe, even when they're talking about black characters, even when they are depicting black characters, in the case of Stowe, maybe in the case of Melville too, depending on how you read Benito Cereno, maybe they're trying to make us feel sympathy for African American characters, make us feel the injustices being inflicted upon them. Stowe definitely does that. Melville maybe does that. But even when they're doing all of that, it's almost always through the prism of a white character or a narrator that is presumably white. So there is that sort of secondhand remove that one almost experiences because, the experience of a Melville or a Stowe isn't going to equip them to fully capture the experience of a Babbo or a Henry or other enslaved characters. So Delaney is doing something innovative because he's able to get us closer. And again, he's sharing aspects, particularly of, African American culture, enslaved African American culture, that would have been very unfamiliar, like to a lot of white readers of that time period. So he's capturing dialect, the way slaves would have spoken. He's capturing certain customs that they would have had, sort of their unique interpretation and use of Christianity. And I hope you guys are noticing some of the dialogue that sort of is centered around religion. And Henry sort of rejects some of the religious practices of many of the older slaves who, in his mind, perhaps use Christianity maybe as a crutch or as a way to kind of justify their own oppression. And Henry seems very aware that, the slaves have sort of been given a certain version of Christianity by this larger slaveholding culture that they belong to, literally. This is sort of the religion of the masters, the religion of the slave owners that's being sort of given to the slaves. They were, many of them were forced to convert to Christianity when they came over. Some were, may have already been Christian, but many were sort of forced to adopt a sort of particular version of Christianity that was enforced by the dominant society. Some slaves from Western Africa were Muslims, and in many cases would have to, continue to practice their faith privately, sort of in secret. So, Henry seems aware of that, we're sort of taking their religion and sort of using it to make us feel better, but he doesn't really see that as a productive use of religion. So that's sort of a running feature of the book. There's a lot of conversations about that. But again, Delaney's showing us these specific aspects of African American culture. And he is getting closer and more granular. So again, we learn about beliefs and cultural practices, but we also learn about some of the peculiar features of slaveholding societies, right? And again, for readers who maybe lived in New England or New York City or other parts of the country where slavery had long been abolished, this would have been very unfamiliar. So again, we're learning a lot about different regions. And this is something I want you guys to notice in part one. Henry's going on this journey really throughout the Southeast, starting from the Franks plantation in Mississippi. He departs and first goes west, I'm pretty sure. He goes to what was then called Indian Territory, now known as the state of Oklahoma. And then from there, he goes to Arkansas. The scene I want to start with is actually when he's in Arkansas visiting some of those relations of his Aunt Rachel and Uncle Jerry. I want us to go there, chapter 21, the chapter called Whatnot. If you guys could actually turn there, I believe it starts on page 89. But I want to look at a scene that unfolds a few pages in to the chapter, starting around maybe like page 92. But he goes on these travels, right? He goes throughout the South. He visits different parts of sort of slaveholding society, slaveholding America. And remember, not all of these places would necessarily become part of the Confederacy, though most of them would. Arkansas, Mississippi, the Carolinas would. But he also goes to Kentucky. Kentucky did not join the Confederacy, but it was considered a border state like Maryland, Missouri. They still had slaves, and there were many Confederate sympathizers in those states. They shared certain cultural traits with southern states because of their proximity. Kentucky borders Tennessee, Maryland's right above Virginia. So a lot of the culture in those places were similar. So Henry's going through this larger region. We can really think of it as the Confederacy plus a little bit extra. And he's making his way from what was then called sort of the Old Southwest. Remember when we read Old Southwestern humor, they were talking about Mississippi, Arkansas, parts of Louisiana. So he goes from there all the way to sort of what would have been thought of as an older part of the South, the old seaboard South, Virginia, the Carolinas, some of the original colonies that had been there and had been settled a lot longer than some of those more western sort of southern places like Arkansas. So he notices cultural differences between these different parts of the South. He notices different regional characteristics, right? Things are a little bit different in Arkansas than they are in South Carolina. They're a lot different, in fact. The way slavery sort of operates is a little bit different. Freedom of movement is different. The customs, the practices, the way society is organized, it's different. So it's kind of interesting. We get a little bit of a travelogue. We get these different sort of portraits of different, different regions or different parts of a larger region. So if you start around chapter 17, I think that's when the journey begins. And again, we can just kind of consider this the South writ large. He's traveling through the South, and he's doing this for, I believe, about 10 chapters, from chapter 17 through about chapter 27. So he's traveling through the South in order to recruit more people for his insurrection. So he's largely meeting with other enslaved people, and he's trying to encourage them to join the rebellion that he's planning. So a couple of things to keep in mind here. Obviously, Henry has to keep his travels secret because he himself is enslaved, though, and this is important, we learn that he was actually decoyed or sort of like, illegally tricked into slavery. He, as we learn later in the book, he was born free and was sort of, taken in a way that actually mirrors real history. I don't want to get to that yet. That's something we can talk about in part 2. But that's important to keep in mind. Actually, I think we kind of learn it earlier. But he's talking to other enslaved people. Obviously, enslaved people don't have the freedom to travel, right? So he has to travel under this shroud of secrecy. And some readers, find aspects of his journey to be a little bit improbable. Like, how could he get to all of these places without being detected? And that's a fair question. I don't really have an answer for it, but it's true of a lot of these aspects of slave culture that we're going to be talking about. A lot of historians, literary scholars, we don't necessarily know that much about it. We do know that slaves were able to travel, despite the very restrictive circumstances that they found themselves in. We also know that slaves had pretty complex communication systems and networks. And we see a lot of that on display as Henry is traveling. But a lot of that stuff is still not totally known because it was kept a secret, right? It was secret. It was kept from mainstream white society. So even today, when we have a lot of, we have the benefit of a lot of historical research, we still don't necessarily know exactly how all of these things would have worked, because a character like Henry would not have necessarily been sharing all of the details of his travels, or how, where he hid or where he was able to stay, right? A lot of this stuff would not have been documented really in an official way that would later sort of be there for historians and students to work with. So again, Delaney is creating a little bit of a record that really fills in a lot of gaps when it comes to our own historical knowledge, our own historical imagination. So even a lot of the things that might seem a little bit improbable, I would encourage you to not necessarily dismiss them as improbable plot events or, flaws in Delaney's writing. I would encourage you to at least, accept the possibility that some of the ways that Henry gets around and the ways that he's able to hold these seclusions, these like secret hidden talks or conferences with other slaves, the way that's all carried out, we don't necessarily know. So, we can at least imagine that Delaney really is capturing a lot of that in ways that are pretty accurate. But in this particular chapter, if we go to chapter 21, so this is pretty early on in Henry's travels. He's gone to Oklahoma. He's met with some Chickasaw and Choctaw leaders, and sort of formed a little bit of an alliance with them. Those were southeastern Native American tribes that had been displaced and pushed off their land. I think I talked about this maybe when we were doing the old Southwestern humor. Many of those tribes were native to places like Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and they had been removed during the Indian removal policy that I think we mentioned from the 1830s, the Trail of Tears, as it's known colloquially. So most of the southeastern Native American tribes were forcibly moved during that period. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, Creek, I believe, were the five. So it's interesting that Henry's talking to some of those groups. They've been moved to Oklahoma before it became a state. It was largely just sort of used as a place to put Native Americans who had been displaced from their original homeland. And then later, they were largely dispossessed within Oklahoma when it became a state, and people from other parts of the country could then go and acquire the land that was supposed to be for the Native Americans. So he goes there first, and then he hops over to Arkansas, which shares a border, at least a little bit of a border, I think, with Oklahoma. So this is where I want us to take a look here. In chapter 21, he's visiting Aunt Rachel and Uncle Jerry, and what's called a gentleman patrol shows up. So remember, Henry cannot reveal what he's really up to. So he claims to be a slave who belongs to, I guess he claims to be from Louisiana, but he claims to be related to this couple, and he's there visiting them, but he actually belongs to somebody in Louisiana. So that's like the cover story that they have to tell when the patrol shows up. So this is what I mean. This is one of those details that you might just kind of overlook it or be like, whatever, I don't really know what that is. But let's think a little bit about what this is. So this is a patrol. This is a group of white men who show up unannounced at this slave cabin of an elderly couple who do appear to be enslaved. So what is this? Like, what's going on? This is a particular cultural practice that might not have been recognizable or familiar to people outside of the South. So what's going on? So in many ways, slave patrols, which this is an example of one, many people would say this is one of the forerunners of modern police in a lot of places. So in the South, during slavery, there would be sort of loosely organized groups, kind of like vigilantes, we might think of. Like, again, white men, always white, always men, who would get together and basically go out into the surrounding areas to make sure that no slaves were trying to escape, to make sure that no slaves were out past curfew, because there was always a curfew in place and they could perhaps only travel beyond that if they had written permission from their master. So there were all these rules that had to be enforced. And ostensibly, on the surface, that's what patrols were there for, just to kind of make sure the slaves were behaving and that there was nothing out of order. But that's only part of it. And I hope you guys are noticing that that's kind of what they're doing, but they're also having what they call a spree or a frolic. At one point, one of the white men refers to it as a frolic among the Negroes. So let's just think about what that means for a moment. They're having fun. These are words that connote fun and sort of a carefree, good time. So not only are they on patrol to make sure no slaves are out past curfew or breaking any other rules, they're also looking to have fun amongst African Americans. At first, that might sound kind of benign, but it's not. And Delaney is showing us the true nature of this patrol in a way that a writer like Stowe would really not be able to. So let's just take a look. If you open up to that chapter, and like I said, turn over, I don't know, maybe starting on page 93 and then over to page 94. Just sort of observe the interaction. So these white men show up, and Aunt Rachel has just prepared some food for Henry and her husband, right? Not expecting any company. And then these guys, I believe there's 3 of them, they proceed to eat the food that she's made. They help themselves, right? And they sort of talk in a somewhat friendly way to the elderly African American couple. To Henry, I mean, they're not exactly hostile towards him, somewhat dismissive because he's younger and they don't know him. But they do sort of engage in what we might consider to be friendly banter with Jerry and Rachel. But notice what they're doing, right? They take all the food. They don't ask, right? There's obviously no politeness involved. And then as a token on their way out, they produce like a little bit of tobacco or just like a few odds and ends as a little gift for the couple, even though they've just eaten the couple's dinner. But I want to point out a few other things. So at the top of page 94, the white men are talking while eating the food, and they're sort of complimenting Rachel on her cooking. And one of them says, "Nothing better. Give me at any time the cooking in the Negro quarters before your great house dainties." Okay, so what is he saying there? He's saying he prefers the food that the slaves eat. He says the Negro quarters. That's kind of a more refined way of saying the slave quarters, slave cabins. He's saying he likes the food they eat there. He likes that food. He prefers that food to what you're going to eat at the big house, the slave owner's home, where you're going to have more expensive, sort of more, to use his words, more, dainty things. But he prefers the food in the slave cabins. So we might just kind of throw that out and say, well, who cares? But that's an interesting sentiment. that this character is expressing, and I think it's tapping into an idea that we very much see here, and we kind of saw it in Benito Cereno as well. The way a lot of white people would have regarded African Americans in the 19th century, right? We talked about Delano sort of being amused by African Americans. He likes them the way a lot of other men like dogs. They amuse him. He jokes around with them. He finds them entertaining to an extent. I think we see a little bit of that here with the patrol. They like the food that African Americans prepare. And later, we're going to see that they want to continue to sort of use African Americans to fuel their entertainment and their amusement, but obviously this is a very exploitative, in some cases even very brutal activity. So again, at first, and this is what's so skillfully done, I think, about the scene, at first the gentleman patrol might not seem terribly threatening. And it's also interesting how they're described, right? They are described as being one of the better sorts of patrols. And this is also important. This is an important detail, right? So these guys are pretty respectable members of the local society. They're not like roughnecks, They're not the worst kind of patrol that could have showed up at the cabin. They're somewhat respectable. They seem like professionals. Maybe they're like, lawyers, storekeepers, right? They're sort of middle class. And in this sort of rural community in Arkansas, again, a state that had not been fully settled yet, even right up until the Civil War, by white people, of course. In a place like Arkansas, these were kind of some of the leading figures of the local society. This is kind of a small rural place. They know everybody. People know them. So in some ways, Jerry and Rachel and Henry get off a little bit. They're a little bit fortunate because this is a patrol that's less likely to maybe resort to violence or take things by force. But we later learn what they're going to be doing later. Again, yes, that's right. Two of them were lawyers, but we learned that they're going out for a frolic among the Negroes. So if we really think about the implication, it's kind of chilling because later in the same chapter, Henry gets a little bit of a taste of what this frolic, which might sound innocent, what this frolic really means. So what appears to be happening right after they leave Rachel's, these guys go and join up with Colonel Sprout. And Colonel Sprout has some dogs that he turns loose on unsuspecting black victims. And this is sport. I think it's important that we sort of recognize this is sport. This is an amusement. This is a source of amusement for the white men in this chapter. So basically they sort of place bets on whether or not the dogs are going to catch their intended target in, a certain allotted period of time. I'm not sure exactly, but it's a sport. It's something to gamble on. They're drinking. It's amusing to them. And that's really what the night holds for the patrol. So they're really just out to have a good time. They don't seem all that focused on their police work. Maybe they've already conducted their search or whatever, and now they're just focused on amusement, entertainment. But we see what that means for them. It means inflicting brutal violence on black people. And this isn't the only time that we see it. In chapter 16, which is called Solicitude and Amusement, we see Colonel Franks and some of his friends enjoying a really awful scene, involving a young slave who's sort of being forced to put on this humiliating performance while also being, whipped. But this is amusing for Colonel Franks and his friends. This is entertainment. It's sport. And that's also what we see in chapter 21. It's sport. It's fun for them. So they'll eat the African Americans' food. They might be entertained by African Americans, performing music or dancing or other cultural practices. But here in Blake, a lot of it is ultimately boiled down to some kind of violent transaction. And ultimately, a lot of these amusements, a lot of these frolics or sprees, they're really just about victimizing African Americans. They're hard to read, and I think they're kind of hard. Again, that they might strike us as like not always plausible. Maybe, I mean, I have seen that reaction with other readers, like, oh, I don't know that would really happen, or I don't know that characters would be behaving in that way, even if we acknowledge the horrors implied in slavery as an institution. It still might be sometimes difficult to imagine that these somewhat respectable guys that are at Rachel's eating her food would later participate in such a brutal, sort of barbaric practice. But they did. I mean, there is record and history and sort of acknowledged fact that things like this definitely happen. But again, Delaney is taking us there in a way that a lot of white authors would not have. And he's delivering a high level of accurate detail. And this is the kind of stuff that slaves in the South would have encountered on a regular basis. So, again, just kind of think a little bit more about some of those details, the patrol, the frolic, what constitutes amusement for a lot of the white characters, because that is all sort of what makes this a rather unique and sort of searing portrait, of slave culture. But again, there's this weird proximity that we have to acknowledge between white and black characters. And sometimes that almost takes on the appearance of friendliness or familiarity. But again, I think Delaney wants us to see that even though certain aspects of culture might be shared, like the food, in many cases, masters would have been invited to slave gatherings, the social gatherings that slaves were permitted to have, usually on Sundays. And the masters would watch the slaves dance or perform athletic feats or, do other sort of cultural practices that the masters found interesting. So again, there's record of that. There's a known history of sort of white Southerners appreciating certain aspects of African American culture while also brutalizing African Americans and denying them, their basic humanity and their basic rights. It seems contradictory in some ways, but again, Delaney is showing us that it's really not. This is not transculturation, right? This is not a cultural exchange. There's nothing equal. It's really just exploitation, domination, and then there are these terrifying outbursts of violence. So that chapter really gives us a close look at that. And just in that brief moment with Colonel Sprout and the dogs, just pay attention, to how Sprout, the character, is speaking. Pay attention to that dialogue. Pay attention to a little bit of the details you see there. It might put you a little bit in mind of Old Southwestern humor. Sprout almost could be a character in a Simon Suggs adventure, right? He kind of talks like Suggs, right? This is a type. This is a character type that you're often going to see in Old Southwestern humor, but other literature of the period. This is a type characteristic of a particular part of the South. Often, again, that Old Southwest, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana. Many of them had military titles, even though they might not have necessarily been in the military. They were kind of hucksters, scam artists, gamblers. This is a character type. So again, Delaney's borrowing a little bit of this. We've talked about how he's using the sentimental novel, sort of that style, that form, for much of part one. But even in this one little brief scene, we might even see a little bit of crossover with Southwestern humor. At least we can notice that Sprout is a type of character that we could see in Hooper or Longstreet or one of these other Southwestern humorists. But here, it's really not funny. There's nothing funny about that scene at the end of chapter 21. It's pretty harrowing, but again, it's quite realistic. So I already mentioned a few other aspects of slave culture. Their dialect, which I do recognize can be hard to read at times. It can maybe be a little bit hard to understand. But again, we have to keep in mind that most of these slave characters are illiterate. So obviously that's going to affect, their use of English. So they sort of have their own dialect, their own style of pronunciation, which is of course very different from the way white characters would have spoken. So that's another authentic aspect of Delaney's portrayal, and also the presence of Christianity in the lives of many enslaved characters. I've already kind of mentioned that, but it's really important and it gets emphasized a lot. And Henry, again, notice that Henry does not speak in the same dialect that most of the other slaves do. And Henry does not practice the same brand of Christianity either. So he is consistently set aside. He is kind of a messianic sort of character. He's sort of the chosen one. He's on the hero's journey. He's different from others. Some people find him to be a little stiff, maybe a little condescending at times to other characters. But yeah, he is set apart largely by how he speaks and how he views Christianity. So McGann talks about this. I think this is in some of his endnotes when he talks about biblical phrasings. That's what he calls it. Biblical phrasings that a lot of the slaves sort of use, a lot of what they're talking about, a lot of their references, even a lot of their word choice comes directly from Scripture. That's what McGann means. There's all these allusions, all of these references to Scripture. So we see that with characters like Daddy Joe and Mammy Judy. And they're often focusing on passages of Scripture that sort of talk about trials and tribulations. And we can understand why. But McGann talks about this, right? This is, and this is a really rich vein of scholarship, how, enslaved populations were able to use certain aspects of Christianity that really spoke directly to their experiences, right? The veil of tears, right? They probably often thought of themselves as the Israelites who were sort of wandering, had been dispossessed, and the oppressors were probably sort of akin to Pharaoh, if you're thinking about the Bible, right? So white Americans were the oppressors. They were Pharaoh. But just think about it. That's an interpretation that's obviously very different from how a lot of white Christians would have viewed the Bible. I mean, we talked about the Puritans and how they thought of themselves as the Israelites. They were wandering in the wilderness. They had been promised, sort of a new land by God. So interesting how a lot of that can get repurposed. And the African Americans were able to use a similar type of identification, but it certainly means something different, for them. But again, Henry rejects a lot of this kind of Christianity that he sees from other slaves. Again, he calls it the religion of my oppressors. And he argues that the providence of God can really only be fully understood and appreciated through a specifically black interpretation. And this is important to Martin Delaney. I believe Delaney might have also believed that. So again, this is a particular orientation or perspective that would have been rather strange, almost alien to white audiences in the 1850s or 1860s. So another thing we have to be aware of, that this book, is representing a different way of thinking, really, compared to a lot of our other works And certainly that's true of religion. And again, McGann points out that Henry is a little bit like a Messiah as he journeys. We see the word Advent several times during his journey. And that word means expectant waiting and preparation for both the celebration of the nativity of Jesus and the return of Jesus at the second coming. So we might notice some parallels between Henry and Jesus. I don't think he is supposed to be Jesus, but I think he's supposed to perhaps share some qualities. And again, there's a lot of emphasis on God's will, divine providence, this idea of God providing sort of protective or spiritual care, God perhaps intervening at certain times to prevent certain things from happening or to protect certain people. So you can also find evidence of that. But again, Henry is echoing a lot of what Delaney and other African-American intellectuals of the 19th century were saying. I talked about this a little bit last week, this idea that enslaved people have to stop waiting for their deliverance. They have to stop waiting for something good to happen. They must take action. This idea that, again, that's part of that sort of larger process of independence and self-determination. So oftentimes it was thought that maybe God would sort of provide deliverance. God would rescue them. But Henry sort of favors a more direct, active role. And that's another way that he's set apart a little bit from other slave characters. Yeah. So again, as we look at his journey, if you look at that part of part one, it's a little bit like a travel log, a little bit like little ethnography. You know, he's gathering information, details about different regions, the people who live there. And again, we're noticing things that were really true about these different parts of the South. You know, in a place like Arkansas, you know, that's kind of described as the backwoods. Again, it was still being settled. You know, towns and civic institutions were still being established there. So there was a certain brutality that we certainly see on display, but Henry finds that it's a little bit easier to travel. And the slaves in Arkansas already have a pretty sophisticated communication network. Again, that we don't fully understand, but they were able to talk to one another, send messages, you know, in some cases even across state borders. So there are a lot of things in Arkansas that kind of appeal to Henry's insurrection plan, right? The ability to kind of move freely, communicate, and the fact that there might be a little bit less oversight because it's just a little bit more sparsely populated. So there's just fewer white people around compared to other parts of the South. So that's kind of interesting. And again, contrast that to what he finds when he goes to the Atlantic coast, when he goes up through Georgia and the Carolinas, eventually goes up to Virginia. In places like Charleston, South Carolina, he really doesn't have much freedom of movement. There's a very restrictive system in place there that really controls slaves to the point where it's very difficult to have seclusions. You know, it's difficult to put together any plans, and it's difficult to find willing recruits because a lot of people are, of course, worried about getting caught. So where the slave laws are especially strict, he runs into some problems, and he's not able to have as much success with his recruitment efforts. So again, that's kind of interesting. Those are interesting regional details, and they kind of make sense just based on what we know about history. These older slave-holding places like South Carolina, Virginia, these are very old societies. So the mechanisms of control, the mechanisms of oppression have really been fine-tuned and perfected in places like Charleston, which was one of the biggest slave ports in the early U.S., even bigger at times than New Orleans. So in a place like that, yeah, Henry, he can't do as much. But in the old Southwest, place like Arkansas, yeah, there's a lot more freedom of movement, or up around the Red River. But again, there's a lot of violence up there. There's a lot of unpredictability. There's kind of that frontier sort of way of life where there's lots of disorder. But there are some advantages as well. So he learns all of that through his travels. And then eventually he lands in the Dismal Swamp, which is a real place in North Carolina. And I just wanted to visit that chapter briefly. That's chapter 24, A Flying Cloud. And this is another example of what I was talking about with African American culture and the way Delaney is able to capture certain aspects of like African American folklore and history that, again, would have been very unfamiliar to a lot of white audiences. So in the Dismal Swamp, Henry is able to meet up with some old guys, these old characters who have been living in the swamp for a long time, the High Conjurers. So this is another interesting detail. Henry doesn't necessarily believe that these guys possess sort of magical or mystical powers like a lot of other slaves believe. But he recognizes that these old guys who are living in the swamp and are supposed to have these abilities, they play an important cultural role for a lot of slaves in the South. A lot of people respect them, sort of look up to them. So Henry almost like needs their stamp of approval. They're probably too old to take a leading role in his insurrection, but he just kind of wants to get them to like sort of sign off on it. He wants to maybe learn a little bit from them. So these are sort of legendary figures in African American imaginative and cultural history. So Gamby Golar and Maudie Gomis. These are sort of quasi-historical figures, according to McGann. But he says they're really a part of sort of African American culture of the time. But according to Henry, their usefulness has kind of expired. He sees them as being sort of part of the old generation. He's more about the new. But interesting to note that these guys kind of represent older rebellions. So if you look at that scene, they're even sort of talking a little bit. They mention a few previous insurrections. They're sort of linked to Turner and Prosser and these earlier figures who had led slave rebellions. And Nat Turner wasn't that far from there. Gabriel Prosser was also not far from the Dismal Swamp, which extends for a pretty good part of like sort of northeastern North Carolina. So not far from southern Virginia, where Nat Turner led his rebellion. But also these guys are kind of linked to the American Revolution. So they're really a part of American history, but they also serve as sort of memorials or testaments to an older history of rebellion and insurrection. So that kind of makes them important as well. And they bestow the title of High Conjurer on Henry. And then when he goes back and tells his friends, his co-conspirators, Andy and Charles, afterwards, again, the way Henry sees it is really the only benefit to being named High Conjurer is now he has more credibility with some of what he considers more superstitious slaves. Now they're going to be more inclined, to follow him because he has that approval. He's gotten that title from the old heads in the Dismal Swamp. So again, he's very skeptical. He doesn't really place a lot of value on the powers that these guys are supposed to have, but he still acknowledges that getting their respect, getting their approval is kind of important. And again, they come from this sort of old colonial stock that Henry also seems to think is important. He likes a lot of the slaves in the old Southwest that originally came from Virginia or the Carolinas. That's where they first entered the country, and then they were taken further west as expansion continued. So he's very particular about what he's looking for. And remember, he goes to Kentucky, at one point, and decides that the slaves there are just a little bit too complacent, and he doesn't think they're really ready for rebellion. So a lot of his determinations about who he's going to recruit, who can help him, a lot of those are based on regional characteristics. So that's an interesting thing to observe in part one. But again, remember that Henry is set apart from a lot of the other slaves, and part of that, we talked about that he speaks differently, he views Christianity differently, but also he's literate. That's very important. He can read and write. He was free-born. He's originally from the Caribbean, as we do learn. And remember, he was decoyed when young and forced into slavery. And again, I think he's supposed to be free when our action begins, when he's on Frank's plantation, but he's like serving Frank's. But I think he's technically free, but he's there on account of his enslaved wife. So kind of a complicated situation, but he has been enslaved at previous times, but he was not born into slavery. So again, that's another thing that makes him a little bit different. But also keep in mind this idea of being decoyed into slavery. Again, that happened a lot. That might seem strange, or it might seem like one of those improbable, sentimental novel aspects, but it's really not. Some of you might have seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. That was a book first, and it first came out in 1853, written by Solomon Northup, the guy who experienced all of that. He was decoyed into slavery. He was a free man, a free African American in New York. Northup was. He was like a professional musician, I think, and he was decoyed into slavery and brought down south before eventually acquiring his freedom after 12 years. So there's a lineage of this. So Northup published that book in 53. That was not a work of fiction, but it was among the first books published by an African American in the U.S. Not the first, but again, we talked about how the first novel was the first novel written by an African American, Clotel, came out just a few years before Blake. So, anyway, just be aware that that particular part of Henry's backstory is, very much based on history, based on a lot of established fact. Okay, so that's probably enough about part one, and I will try to wrap things up here quickly. But I wanted to point out a few things in part two that I thought were really interesting. And again, we discussed, or at least I mentioned last time, the stylistic and tonal shift that you might observe as you transition from part one to part two. We talked about how part one often reads a lot like a sentimental novel. And then in part two, well, we get that at the beginning of part two. The early portions of part two have a lot in common with part one, right? Except the setting has changed. When part two begins, we are in Cuba. But remember, the first task that Henry is trying to accomplish in part two is finding his wife. And he does that in a very classic sort of sentimental novel moment. He discovers that this sort of prematurely aged servant that he met earlier at this hacienda is actually his wife. So we get mistaken identity here. We get a tearful reunion. These were kind of hallmarks of sentimental plots. Little bit improbable, yes, very emotional. But again, we can see that Delaney's very familiar with sentimental novels. He clearly read some, and he knew some of the techniques, and he is borrowing them at times. But I would argue that as part two progresses, he does kind of move away from the sentimental model. And what we end up with is something that might be a little bit more approaching historical fiction, because one thing that he does in part two is he takes some real people and he introduces them into this, largely fictional novel. So we meet Placido, in Cuba. He's a famous mixed race poet of Cuba who was a real person. And later we find out that he's actually Henry's long lost cousin, I believe. Again, maybe a little bit improbable, but sort of typical of a lot of sentimental plots. So certain aspects of the sentimental style never fully go away, but we get a lot of emphasis on the actual insurrection plan. We get a lot of the sort of inner politics, a lot of details there, but we also get a couple of moments that I just think are really fascinating because Delaney's doing something pretty innovative and pretty modern in these moments. But first, before we get there, I just wanted to point out the potential slave insurrection that we see in part 2 that should remind us a little bit of Benito Cereno. But again, there's a lot of historical precedent for this. So you guys might be familiar with the real and the actually successful uprising on board the Amistad. In 1839, there was a movie made about that as well. That was also a slaving vessel in which the slaves took control and they were able to navigate it, I believe, to Massachusetts. They got it up to a state in the U.S. where slavery had already been abolished. And I do believe things were ultimately ruled in their favor. So perhaps really I misspoke earlier when I said none of the insurrections in U.S. history had really worked. If we consider that insurrection on board that ship as kind of a self-contained thing, it actually did work. So kind of a sharp contrast to Benito Cereno. And the Mindi people, that was a particular tribe that largely comprised the people taken as slaves on board that ship, and I believe we see that name in the book as well. So that's a pretty deliberate sort of reference to that particular event. But notice, in the novel, the insurrection on board the slaving vessel never quite happens. Even though the whites are very worried about it, there's all these rumors about Henry's involvement, but it never quite happens. That's kind of interesting. And again, it's kind of characteristic of this book in a larger sense. That's not quite what we expect, maybe. We expect something more decisive there. Maybe we expect more action, but instead it doesn't happen. And I think there's some different ways to interpret that. We might think of it just as a weather event getting in the way, but we could also maybe see it as divine providence, God intervening to prevent a hasty and perhaps ill-conceived rebellion. And Henry, who you should observe is now being referred to as Blake, his last name, seems to sort of wordlessly accept the change in plans. And he doesn't really try to change it. But he does intervene in his own way. He arranges for many of the slaves on board the ship to be purchased by light-skinned African Americans, friends and allies of his, thus ensuring that they'll, essentially be freed, or at least be allowed a much greater degree of freedom. And he also invites the leaders of the enslaved Africans to take part in his council, this sort of growing alliance that he is organizing once they all get back to Cuba. So that's kind of an interesting moment where once again Delaney kind of perhaps upsets our expectations a little bit. But again, I think it's also telling because, the insurrection doesn't happen perhaps because the timing isn't right. It had not been planned sufficiently. The weather does not cooperate. And this is kind of a reminder that a lot of the insurrections that had previously happened did fail. And we might even anticipate that this one will also eventually fail, because we also learn as part 2 goes on that what we're seeing in Cuba, again, is based on a real slave insurrection that took place in Cuba decades earlier, known as the Conspiracy of the Ladder. And that took place back in the 1840s. It was put down but a lot of the details in part 2 echo that particular historical event. So a lot of critics assume that that's what we're seeing here, that what's playing out in part 2 is the conspiracy of the latter, this particular Cuban slave insurrection that was ultimately put down. So if you buy into that, then you can assume that eventually the insurrection that Henry plans does fail. And some take the character of Gopher Gondolier as sort of a representation of the kind of hasty, overly emotional machinations that can often sink real revolts, real rebellions. So there's all that historical linkage that you can rely on, but I don't think we have to read Henry's rebellion in quite that way. We can still maybe imagine that it happens differently, because again, Delaney is combining fact and fiction in part 2. So I just wanted to show you 2 scenes kind of quickly here. The first one is on page 212. If we can go there. So this is the very end. This is the very end of the chapter entitled Significant. And this is a very interesting move that Delaney makes. So we have a little song performed by the character of Gaspar. And he's singing a song called I'm a-Goin' to Africa. But notice the spelling of Africa is not the conventional sort of traditional spelling there. Okay? And I also want you to notice the footnote that we have at the bottom of the page. Okay? So this is what I mean about combining fact and fiction. So we're on board the slaving vessel, I think, at this point, and Gaspar is singing this song on board the ship. Okay? But notice what he's saying in the song. I'm going to Africa where the white man does not stay. I catch him by the collar, makes the white man holler. It's funny. But then we learn with the footnote, and this was a footnote provided by Delaney. And he tells us this song, the song being sung by Gaspar, was sung by a little black boy sitting by himself on a fence in the South, musing. So this is something Delaney starts to do. He takes a real event, something that he witnessed or experienced in the South, and he sort of transports it to the pages of his novel, but he alters it in the process. So he puts this song in the mouth of a different character. He changes the location. He changes some of the details, but a lot of the sort of, basic points of the event remain in place. So why is he doing that? And how does Africa here, with that unique spelling, how does it function again as sort of a conceptual space, right? Going to Africa, maybe not just literally, right? But also going to a place, going to a cultural place, going to a state of mind where white people cannot go, where white people cannot oppress you, catch you, victimize you, or make the rules, right? A non-white space. For a lot of intellectuals like Delaney, there was a lot of value just in sort of conceiving of those kinds of spaces, places where black characters could practice their culture freely, and could sort of have a level of self-determination that just was not possible in much of the U.S. So that's an interesting scene. And then something very similar, we can see something very similar in chapter 74. So if you jump way ahead, this is like page 307. And this involves Placido. But again, what we're seeing here in this chapter, and the chapter is called American Tyranny, Oppression of the Negroes, what's happening in this chapter is, again, it's like this fictional reimagining of real events. So we see Placido sort of attacked and brutally assaulted by a storekeeper. But this is happening in Cuba. But again, based on the footnote that we get at the bottom of page 307, again, a footnote provided, I believe, by Delaney, he's telling us a similar circumstance really transpired in Wheeling, Virginia, between a white man called a gentleman, with scare quotes around that word, and a black man. So remember, I mentioned Delaney is from what is now West Virginia. When he was born, it was still just Virginia. So Wheeling, the city that he mentions there, is in West Virginia. So again, now it is. So he's talking about a specific event that he witnessed in Wheeling, West Virginia, but he's reimagining it with a real character from history who presumably was not in Wheeling, this Cuban poet and freedom fighter. He's reimagining that real life scene in his work of fiction. So this is kind of an innovative, sort of imaginative technique that he does use. But again, we should ask ourselves, why is he doing it? And why combine fact and fiction? Why combine history and, well, maybe we can think of it as, his own personal history with a larger history of slavery in the Americas. Or again, in part 2, largely tapping into Cuban history and certain aspects of Cuban slavery and Cuban enslaved culture, which might differ a little bit from what we saw in part 1. So that's another thing that you should observe. We are seeing different systems of slavery on display. We can contrast what we see in the U.S. South to what we see in Cuba. Of course, there's similar levels of brutality, injustice, and suffering, but like the mechanisms of slavery work a little bit differently. Right? There are different rules, there are different customs, different laws governing how slavery functions. So Delaney also shows us that with a lot of granular detail. But you can notice a few other things. There's a lot of repetitions in part 2. Notice how certain scenes or certain events will sort of get replayed or, again, sort of reimagined in slightly different circumstances. So again, we see a lot of things repeated, particularly in the later chapters. We also get a lot of characters, often Henry, just sort of espousing a lot of views that would have been supported by Delaney, right? So sometimes Henry might be serving a little bit like Delaney's mouthpiece, views on religion, how to achieve racial equality, how people of mixed race might fit in, how biracial people can sort of fit into this larger plan. And again, you might want to look into the conspiracy of the ladder, or La Escalera. That's the real-life Cuban insurrection that kind of serves as the model for much of what we see in part 2. And again, look at the foot. So I was mentioning Gopher Gandelier and how a lot of critics think that he represents the sort of emotional excesses that could sometimes sink an insurrection. So that's coming from footnote number 288, provided by McGann, that you should be able to see towards the end there. So let me just verify that I got that, because you guys can. Yeah, that's McGann's footnote. So on page 331 of our book, footnote number 288, McGann sort of making that move. So think about that. Think about how you want to read Henry's insurrection and how you think it would ultimately have concluded. So that's it. I think we're all exhausted, but I do hope you guys can gain an appreciation for this book. I know, like I said, it can be a little bit difficult and tough to get through at times, but we should also just appreciate the fact that by writing this book, by writing such a frank, portrayal of slavery in the U.S., Delaney was putting his own life on the line. So he's an interesting and important guy for a lot of different reasons. This is just one of them. But again, let's appreciate sort of the unique cultural circumstances that he's dealing with just as an African American author in the middle of the 19th century on the eve of the Civil War. So hopefully you guys are feeling good. Before we go, let's just talk very briefly about what we're doing this week work-wise. So again, the proposal and critical summary, not meant to stress you guys out. Don't get too worried about it. I just want to know what you're thinking, what you're planning to write about for your final paper. So the proposal can be very brief. I don't need a ton of detail. Just give me a general idea of the argument you would like to make, because these are going to be argumentative papers. Ultimately, what's your angle? What's your interpretation? At least what are you thinking it might be? And I can give you a little bit of feedback. And then the critical summary is just a way for you to get started on the research. So you don't have to find all of your research. I just want you to maybe grab 2 or 3 sources, tell me a little bit about those sources, give me some citations so I can maybe check them out as well. Just so I can see that you're beginning to read a little bit more and gain a greater understanding. And I'll talk about this more next week when we really discuss the final paper, but you guys need to start thinking of yourselves as scholars, as critics. You're taking part in these larger sort of critical discussions, these larger debates that are circulating around your chosen text. Even if you don't always feel confident, that's what you need to project. You are taking part in these larger conversations, so you need to learn a little bit more about the conversation. You guys have probably heard this before. I had a professor in college who would always say, think about writing a paper like you just arrived at a party and you've arrived a little bit late. So you get there and a lot of people are already there and you've arrived alone, and a lot of people at the party are already having conversations. They're talking to each other, right? People are talking, people are interacting. So you want to join a conversation, obviously, that would be nice. But before you can, first you have to listen a little bit. You can kind of walk over to some people, but before you just jump in with words and ideas of your own, you have to get an idea of what they're talking about. You have to learn a little bit more about the conversation before you're ready to contribute. So that's kind of what research is, right? You're learning more about what other people have said, what other people have done with that text, and then you can join it. So if you have any questions about the assignment, let me know. But just to be clear, and don't freak out, I'm making the final deadline for the final essay and the final exam December 16th. So that is the Friday of exam week. Okay, so I don't mean that you have to do them simultaneously. I'm just giving you the maximum amount of time to get those in. So Friday of exam week is about as late as anybody can really wait for work, because grades are going to be due the following Tuesday, the 20th. So I need them by that Friday, but you have that amount of time, so don't feel rushed. And you can do those assignments in whichever order you want. I would recommend, maybe, if you're asking me, and you're probably not, I would recommend doing the paper. Well, it doesn't matter. Just keep this in mind. The paper will take longer, okay? By design. The paper is worth more, it's more important to me, and it's going to take longer for you to complete it. So give yourself more time for the paper. The exam is really designed to be done in a couple of hours, maybe 2 hours, 2.5 hours. It is cumulative, but I'm not going to make you write another full-length essay. The exam is going to be a little bit short and sweet in terms of what we're actually producing. So just keep that in mind. The paper requires more time, more effort, more energy. You will need to study a little bit for the exam, but I'm giving you a study guide so you don't have to create it yourself. And if you've read everything, if you've even read most things, you should probably be fine on the exam. If you still need to finish something, if you still need to go back and read something, I would recommend doing that before the exam. But really, the best way to prepare for a lit exam is to read the lit. And if you know it, if you're pretty familiar with it, nothing I ask you on the exam should trip you up. Okay, but of course I'll give you that sample exam. I don't think I published that this week, but that's available in the week 15 module. You can see how I organize my exams, the kinds of questions I ask. The study guide is already available in this week's module. So just get to this stuff, according to your own schedules, but just be aware that December the 16th is the final deadline. And get me that proposal and critical summary by next week. If you're done with it by the end of this week, that's great, but you can also work on it a little bit into next week as well. Please reach out if you have questions, if you want to talk more about the paper or the exam or anything else. I will be available. Just email me. And I will see you next week for our final lecture of the semester. And I really will go through the exam format. We'll talk about IDs, short answer, and the short essay component. So most of next week will be geared towards the final paper and the final exam, but I will talk a little bit about circumstance as well. So I'll see you then. Good luck getting started on all of our final work.